Hello students, welcome to Distinction Learning Platform, and on this platform you'll find revisions, tests, explanation to difficult topics, a lot of stuff. So before we begin our lessons, make sure that you subscribe so that you can be updated with our upcoming videos. To make the story short, let us begin. Don't forget to like the video. Okay, so in this video, we're talking about parasitology, okay? Introduction to parasitology. Remember that this is under microbiology. So to just take you back, remember that microbiology is further divided into what? Parasitology, virology, bacteriology, and what? Fungology. So those are the parts that we'll be talking about under what? Microbiology. And remember that this is medical microbiology. Okay? So since we're talking about parasitology, if you look at parasitology, that's the study of what? Parasite. Okay? So parasitology basically is just the study of what? Parasite, and we'll talk more about the parasite. What is it? What is a parasite? Okay, we'll talk about the types of parasite and how we use parasite to categorize or maybe to classify something that is very important or medical important. Okay. So now parasitology, if you look at parasitology, again parasitology is further divided into what? Three important parts. So what are we saying? This same parasitology is further divided into what? Three parts. So this first part, also the second part, and the last part. Okay, what are those three important parts? Okay, so we talk about the start of what? The start of protozoa. So we call that field as what? Protozoology. Okay, so we'll start with the start of what? Protozoa or protozoology. Okay, that's the start of protozoas. We'll talk about that. Then the other one is what? The start of helminth. That is the this is helminthology. Okay, so the study of helminth or worms is what we call helminthology. Okay, and the last one is what? It's a study of what? The arthropods. So there are some insects that we talk about that help to transmit what? Parasite from one place to another. We call them what? Arthropods. We'll study them in details. Like a mosquito, that should be one of the arthropods. Okay, because a vector that should carry what? Parasite or transmit parasite. So what we call that study? We call it what? Entomology. We call it what? Entomology. So just to give you something, so if you are studying like microbiology, more especially parasitology is something that can confuse you. So if you know now the category starting from the major group, then going to subcategories, in that will be understanding parasitology. Okay, like I've studied parasitology is it has these three main branches like that. Okay. Our first branch that we'll start talking about is what? Protozoology. Basically, start talking about what? Protozoa. Don't worry, okay? Don't worry about that. Now, since we've understood about the parasitology, then what else are we supposed to understand? Let us understand about this same parasite that we're talking about, because the main thing that makes us to come up with what? Parasitology. So let's talk about what? A parasite. What is a parasite? So a parasite basically is what? It's just a living organism that what? That will always feed on what? On a host for nourishment and also maybe for shelter. It's going to use the what? The host. So that is what we call a parasite. So what is a parasite? So what we are saying, a parasite is what? Basically we are saying, let's use red. So we are saying a living organism. Okay, a living organism. Sorry. Okay, that what does it do? Okay. So that depends. So let's use depends. That depends on the what? Host. So let's use host. Let's use blue. Host. Okay. For what? For food and shelter. Okay, very important definition. So it's just a living organism. It can be microorganism or macro organism. Okay, so that's what we call a parasite. It's going to use the host in order for it to eat something and in order for it to have what? Proper shelter. Then that's what we call a parasite. Now the question that you can ask is that, okay, I know the definition of a parasite. It's going to depend on the what? On the host. But what are the types of parasite? You need to know that in case you are examining on that. So what are those parasites that are very, very important? Okay, what are the types? So the first thing is the types of parasite. It will depend on what? It will depend on two important things. It will depend on the location, okay, on the location where you can find them, or on the number of what cells that they have. So we'll start with the number of cells that they have. So types of parasites would depend on what? So types of parasites would depend on what? We are saying they would depend on what? Cell number. So let's just say cell number. It will depend on what? Cell number. Okay. And it will also depend on what? It will also depend on the location. So it will also depend on the location. We'll talk about that, okay? We'll talk about it here, okay? So let's start with the cell number. So there are two types of parasites. There are parasites that have one cell, and there are parasites that have got what? Many cells. Basically, let's use medical terms. We have what we call unicellular parasite and what? Multicellular parasite, okay? So under the cell number, what are we saying? We are saying there are some parasites that are what? That we call unicellular. So we are going to say unicellular. Basically, they have one cell. Unicellular parasite. So let's just say P, parasite. And what else? We have what we call multicellular parasite. Multicellular parasite. Let's just use also P there. So those are the two important categories, okay? So now let's dive in further on unicellular parasite and what? Multicellular parasite, because you need to understand those type of parasites that have got what? One cell, and those parasites that have got what? Many cells. What are those? So let's start with what? The parasite that have got what? One cell. What is that? So this one, unicellular parasite. What is that parasite? What do we call that parasite that has got one cell? We call them what? Protozoa. Very important. You need to be getting that, because if you miss the introduction to parasitology or microbiology, you are going to be having difficulties when it comes to what? Understanding the different what? Parasite that will be studied. So we are saying unicellular parasite. Unicellular parasite, what is a good example? We know it is what? Protozoa. Okay, that is a good example. Unicellular parasite, protozoa. Okay, what about multicellular parasite? Can you remember that? Multicellular parasite, what are those? Worms. Okay, we call them just helminth. This one. Instead of just saying worms, we are going to get at least a medical term which we call helminth. Okay, so we are saying good example of this is what? Helminth. Okay, this. Instead of saying, the other term that they use is what? Worms. Okay, these helminth or worms, we are going to talk about them in what? In future. Okay, so for now, let's just talk about the subcategories of what? Worms. What are those worms that we are talking about? Just know about what? Three major subgroups of what? Worms. Those are the ones that we'll talk about in what? Future. You need to know them. What are those? So later we are saying here, under helminth or worms, they are further categorized into what? Three. We are saying we are further categorized into what? Three. What is the first one? The first one is called what? Nematode. Nematode. Okay. I'll put a good example of a nematode. Good example of a nematode. Well, we'll come and talk about the Ascaris lumbricoid. So let's just call it Ascaris. Okay. So good example of a nematode is what? Ascaris lumbricoid. So we'll come and talk about it in future, okay? But just know that one subgroup of worms is what? Nematode. What is a good example of a nematode that is under nematode is what we call Ascaris lumbricoid. We'll come and talk about that largest worm that can be found in the intestine, okay? We'll come and talk about it. What else? Okay, there's also another one. We call it what? What do we call that? Do you know it? We call it cestoid. Okay? Cestoid. Okay? Cestoid, good example. What is a good example of a cestoid? Cestoid, good example is what? Tinea. Okay, we'll come and talk about the tinea coli. We'll come and talk about them. Okay? That's a good example of what? A cestoid. Make sure that you understand that. What else? The last one is what? Trematode. trematode. Okay, trematode is what we call that is the what, the last one. Okay, what could be the good example of a trematode? Okay, since here we're saying ascaris here, tinea, then what about the trematode? Trematode good example is what, fasciola. So we'll come and talk about the fasciola, hepatica, we'll come and talk about that. Don't worry, okay? But just know a good example of a trematode is what, fasciola. We call it what, fasciola. It's something that is the fun name, fasciola. That's a fun name, okay? But just know that good example of a trematode is what, fasciola. Okay. So this is the thing that we'll come and talk about. The moment we just start talking about the multicellular, after finishing unicellular, we'll start talking about the nematode. After we're done with the nematode, we'll go to cystode and trematode. Then we're going to go to what, the entomology, which is the arthropods. Okay, we should be updated with a video that I'm going to be posting. Okay, then we go to this side. Oh, since we've understood about that, but this one, unicellular, which is protozoa, we'll understand it here, okay, in detail, because the one that we'll start with, like here, amoeba, interamoeba histolytica, is the one that is under what? Protozoa. So here, don't worry, we'll talk about it here. And what are the general features of this protozoa? We'll talk about there, so that you can visualize whatever I'm going to be talking about. Okay. Now let's move on. So this is according to the cell number. Okay, let's go to another one. What did I say? According to what? Location. So according to the what? Location. What do I mean? If I say according to the location, what do I mean? So where you can find them. There are some parasites that lie on the what? Body surface, and there are some parasites that like inside the what? Body tissue. They penetrate inside the what? Body tissues or organs. What are those? So let's start with parasite that likes the what on the body surface. Okay, parasite that likes on the body surface. What do we call those? We call them what? Ectoparasite. So there is the first one. So let us write it here. Okay, let's just write it here. Ectoparasite. Sorry, not echo. Ectoparasite. Parasite. So ectoparasite, that's from the word ecto. Basically, it is the type of a parasite that you can find outside. Okay, so here they like on the body surface. So here in bracket we're going to say they like body surface. Okay, what is a good example of a parasite that likes on the body surface there and doesn't invade? What's a good example of that? Lice. So we can say lice. Okay, mite, all these things. Okay, so let's say tick. Okay, tick. So these are the good example of what a parasite that can be found outside these. Okay, body surface. That is what we call ectoparasite. What is the next one? The next one is what? Apart from the ectoparasite, according to the location, we have now, if there is ecto, there is what? Indo. So the other one is what? Endoparasite. Okay, endoparasite. And this is a very important one. So we know that these are going to penetrate. So here we're going to say these what? They penetrate. They penetrate tissues. Okay, tissues. Penetrate what? Tissue. These are what we call endoparasite. And endoparasite, these are the most common cause of what? Medical, like diseases that are that of what? Medical importance. So that's why we dig further under what? Endoparasite. Okay, so endoparasite, what are we saying? We are saying these are the type of parasite that likes to penetrate the what? The body tissue. They are found usually inside the body. Those are what we call endoparasite. Okay, now good example. What are the examples of endoparasite? There are a lot. Okay, there are a lot. The one that we'll talk about here, the interamoeba histolytica, is one of the what? Endoparasite. The what else? The Cryptosporidium parvum, all those they can be found what? Inside the parasite, inside the host. Okay, but then there are a lot, but Balantidium coli, a lot of them. There are a lot to talk about them. Okay. Now, since we know the endoparasite, then they penetrate the what? Body tissues. Okay. Now, these endoparasites, since there are a lot and they like them, then they are further what? Categorized or subdivided like that. Okay, they are subdivided into something important. What is that? So these endoparasites are further divided, okay, into what? The first one is what? Obligate. Let's just say obligate what? Parasite, okay? What else? Obligate parasite. What else apart from that? We have what we call facultative parasite, okay? Then what else? We have what we call aberrant parasite, okay? And the last one is what? Accidental, okay? Accidental. So let's just say accidental parasite. We don't have much space there. So there, as you can see, they are like this in the parasite. Since they are what? They are important. They are further what? Categorized into something into what? Obligate parasite, facultative parasite, aberrant parasite, and what? Accidental parasite. So we need to understand each of them, okay? What are those? So if you talk about obligate parasites, so what are obligate parasites? So obligate parasites, basically, these are the type of parasite that can't exist or that can't live without what? The host, okay? They depend on the host. Minus the host, they can't what? They can't survive. So what are the examples of those obligate parasites? What are those? Okay? So let us write here. So I'll just give one example, although they are a lot. So I'll say Toxoplasma gondii. Okay, Toxoplasma gondii. There's also Plasmodium, and also maybe Trichomonas vaginalis, those are what we call obligate parasites. They can't exist to survive without what? Without the host. Okay, so let's just put one here, which is Toxoplasma gondii. They can't really survive without what? The host. Then those are what we call obligate parasites, and they're under what? Endoparasite. That's what I said. Okay, those that penetrate the tissues. Okay, then what else? Facultative parasites. So what are facultative parasites? So facultative parasites, basically, these are the parasites that can live on their own. Again, they can also affect the tissues, okay? They can live on their own as non-parasitic form, okay? But also they can exist as what? Parasitic form, and as long as what? They enter into the what? The body of the human, okay, or animals, okay? So those are what we call what? Facultative parasite. What am I saying? I'm saying to say facultative parasite, these are the type of parasite where a parasite can live on its own, okay? And as well as it can do what? It can also affect the animals, okay? It can affect the animals. So that's what we call facultative parasite. So what is a good example of facultative parasite? We'll just give one as well here. Although there are a lot, so we can just say Naegleria fowleri. Okay, so we'll talk about this one. Okay, Naegleria fowleri. This one we'll talk about under amoebas. Okay, we'll talk about the acanthamiba. We'll talk about the Naegleria fowleri. So this one, Naegleria fowleri, is one of the facultative parasites because it can live on its own as well as it can affect what? Animals. Okay. What about this one? Aberrant parasite. What is an aberrant parasite? So aberrant parasite is a type of parasite the moment it affects what? The animal, that will be the end stage. It is not going to develop further. Okay, that is what we call aberrant what? Parasite. Okay, aberrant parasite again is what? It's a type of a parasite the moment it affects the animal, then that will be the end stage of it. It is not going to develop further. So basically, it can't be transmitted from one person to another, okay? So that's what we call aberrant parasite. So what is that aberrant parasite? So good example of that aberrant parasite, it should be a roundworm for what? For dogs, which we call Toxocara. So we call it Toxocara canis, okay? Basically, this is a what? This is a roundworm that affects dogs, but basically, if it affects like human beings, that would be the end of what? The end stage, okay? That's what we call aberrant parasite. Don't get confused with that, okay? Then accidental parasite, this is the last one. Accidental what? Parasite. What is an accidental parasite? That's from the word accidental. Basically, it's a type of parasite. If affects it doesn't really need to affect a certain animal, but if it affects by accident, then that would be what? An accidental parasite. Basically what I mean is like this. It's a type, so like normally that certain parasite doesn't affect that host. It doesn't affect that host. But if you find that host has been affected by that parasite, then it will be what? An accidental what? Parasite. Because normally you can't find that parasite in that host. Okay? But if the moment you find it, it is an accidental what? Parasite. That's what we call accidental parasite. What could be the good example of accidental parasite? We can call it, there is also another parasite which we call Echinococcus granulosus. Echinococcus granulosus, that's an accidental parasite. Okay, we'll talk about it as well. Okay, talk about it under worms. Okay, so a good example of an accidental parasite, we are saying Echinococcus, so you just say E granulosus. Okay, granulosus. Echinococcus granulosus, that is what? A good example of a parasite that can affect a certain individual accidentally. Okay, so those are the endoparasites that I was talking about. Now, the other important parasite apart from the ectoparasite, endoparasite, is also another important one. I talked about under facultative. I talked about a free living parasite. There are also free living what? Parasite. So apart from Indo, the one that can be found inside, apart from the one that can be found on the surface of the body, what else? There is also another one. I'm going to write it here so that we can have more space for other explanation there. So we have what we call free living parasite. So let's just say P. So free living parasite, these are the parasites that live on their own, independent in the what? Non-parasitic form. Okay, so they live on their own. Basically, they don't need even to start affecting other individuals or hosts. Okay, so basically, these parasites, they don't affect any host if they are they are on their own. The moment that they encounter the host, they are going to start affecting that host. Those are what we call free living parasite. So free living parasite. Now what can you say? The same one. Neguela folae. So we can say the good example of a free living parasite is Neguela folae. Okay. Neguela folae. That's a good example of that. Okay. There is also Acanthamoeba. Acanthamoeba is also a free living parasite. Okay. And also Balantidium medullaris is also one of the free living parasite. We'll talk about that. Okay, we'll talk about that. Don't worry. Now, since these are the classification of parasite, then what else? I also talked about what? Host. Okay. Also, you need to understand about the host, because if you don't understand, in future lessons you are going to be having problems. Okay. What is that? So, what is a host? So let's write it here. So if you talk about host basically it is a living organism that is always larger than the parasite, and it's the one that's going to give the habitat or the place for a parasite, so that the parasite can get food from the host and also shelter. Okay, what do I mean? Host is what? It's just a living organism that gives what? Shelter and nourishment to the parasite. That is what we call host. Now, how many types of hosts do we have? There are a lot of hosts that we have, okay? But basically, I'm going to talk about the most common hosts that we talk about, and when it comes to life cycle, all those things, okay? So what is the first one? So the first one is what? Definitive host, okay? Definitive, and I'll just say H. Definitive host. There is also another one which we call intermediate host. So make sure that you get this, because these are the words that will be like talking about it in future lessons. Intermediate, okay, host, intermediate host. Okay, another one, accidental what? Host. Like that. Okay, these are the three important hosts that we need to know. Okay, now if you start with a definitive host, so what is a definitive host? So definitive host is a type of host where what? Sexual reproduction is going to happen. So here we are saying the type of so the reason why we are saying this is a definitive host, it is because sexual reproduction is why is happening. So let's say SR, sexual reproduction is why it is happening. Okay, sexual reproduction is happening. So we talk more about sexual reproduction when it comes to maybe malaria. If you start talking about malaria, we'll talk about more what it means, dermatogony, what does it mean. Okay, we'll talk about a lot in future. Don't worry. So just know that definitive host, the moment you see a parasite is undergoing sexual reproduction. When it comes to multiplication, they are multiplying using what sexual means. Basically, that host is what we call a definitive what host. Okay. Then what about an intermediate host? An intermediate host basically to be opposite to definitive host. That's why what asexual reproduction occurs. So let's say AR, asexual reproduction occurs. That's why that's what we call intermediate host. But if it comes to intermediate host, make sure that you understand something. Intermediate host comes sometimes you can have first intermediate host and second intermediate host, so that maybe you can complete a life cycle. Okay, we'll talk about those types of what parasites that are going to have what host that the first intermediate host and the second intermediate host. We'll talk about that. Okay, don't worry about that in future. Okay, so there are a lot of definitive hosts that we talk about. Maybe if you talk about malaria, if you talk about a mosquito will be what a definitive host, because that's where sexual reproduction will happen. Then intermediate host under malaria, that will be what human beings. Okay, that's why, because asexual reproduction happen. So we'll talk about it in future. Again, accidental host. What do you think about accidental host? What did I say? It's a type of host where what a parasite accidentally affects it. Okay, if the host is being affected accidentally, then that will be called an accidental what host. Remember, a good example of an accidental host is what it can be affected by what, by a certain parasite called what Echinococcus what granulosa. So we talked about that. Okay, here. And where we are here under accidental what parasite. Okay, so those are the important concepts that we need to talk about under what host. Okay, these are very important things that we need to take note. Okay, then okay, there are also something else apart from this, something else that you need to understand. Okay, so I'll write it here. So another something, so relationship between, so let's say between host and what a parasite. Host and, let's just put in full, host and parasite. This is a very important concept that you need to understand. Okay, so there are some terms that we use under like a relationship, the way the host and the parasite, they are going to what to communicate with one another. Okay, so there are some terms that we use. So basically we're going to use what three important terms. Okay, the first one is what, the first one that they use is what we call symbiosis. Okay, this one, symbiosis. And the second one is what commensalism. Okay, then the other one is what parasitism. Okay, parasitism, like that. Okay, parasitism. So symbiosis, commensalism, and what parasitism. Okay, so those are the terms that they use in when it comes to what the relationship between host and what and a parasite. So if you talk about symbiosis is a type of what relationship between host and what parasite, where where both the parasite and the host they are what dependent on what one another. Okay, the host is dependent on the parasite and the parasite is dependent on the what on the host. That's what we call symbiosis. Okay, they both like depend on one another. That's what we call symbiosis. There is no injury. Okay, under symbiosis there is no injury. The host and the parasite, they depend from one another, they benefit from one another. Okay, if you come to commensalism basically is a type of relationship between the host and the parasite, but here now it's only the parasite that is going to what to benefit from the what from the host, but the host is not benefiting from the parasite. Make sure that you get that one. And also important part is what no injury to the host. So starting from here, no injury. Here both they are benefiting. Here just one living organism benefiting, which is what the parasite. No injury. Parasitism now, remember, this is a type of relationship between host and parasite, but the parasite is benefiting from the host, and in the process, during the process, there is harm to the what host. So here we are saying there is what injury. Here, no injury. Here, no injury. Okay. Here, which one is benefiting here? It's the parasite. What about here is the parasite? Here, both. Okay. You need to understand that. So those are the terms that you need to understand. Okay. Now, in the next video, we'll talk about now the introduction to what? Protozoa. Okay. And also, we'll talk about, after talking about the protozoa, then we'll talk about what? Amoeba classification, as well as now Interamoeba histolytica. But just to give you an overview here on how the protozoa looks like, so we'll start talking about it starting from here. But if you look at protozoa, remember here we said to say unicellular is a protozoa, multicellular are what? Worms or helmini. So let's just talk about a little about this protozoa. So protozoa now, they can be further what? Categorized into something that is very, very important. Okay, protozoa, these unicellular organisms, they can be further subdivided into what? The first one is what? Amoeba. So they can be divided into what? Amoeba. That's the first one. Okay, amoeba like what? So there's the Interamoeba histolytica. Okay, there's the Interamoeba what? Coli. There's the Interamoeba gingivalis. Okay, a lot of types of what? Interamoeba. Amoeba. Okay, so they are here. So the good example that I can give you is what? Interamoeba histolytica. Okay, what else? So if you are talking about protozoa, you need to be having those thoughts. Okay, the other one is what? Ciliates. Okay, the other one are what? Ciliates. So ciliates, these, they are going to have what? Spike-like structures on the what? On their surface membrane. Okay, what's a good example of a ciliate? A good example of a ciliate is what? A good example, you can talk about a lot of them. So, but basically, let's talk about the like Trichomonas vaginalis. So, Trichomonas vaginalis is what? A ciliate. So, let's say Trichomonas vaginalis. So, let's say TV. That is Trichomonas vaginalis. One of the good example of what is a ciliate. Okay. What else apart from that? The other one is what is sporozoa. So sporozoa, these are the what? Good example of what? Protozoa. Don't confuse. This is sporozoa and this is protozoa. Sporozoa, good example is what? Plasmodium. Plasmodium. Okay. Plasmodium, like those parasites that can cause what? Malaria. Those are under what is sporozoa. Okay. Sometimes sporozoa, they are sometimes called what? Apicomplexa. So don't get confused. So apicomplexa, they are basically those are we're just talking about sporozoa. What is the last one? The last one is what? Flagellates. Okay. So flagellates, will come and talk about the trypanosomes. Okay, trypanosomes. Those are, and also the leishmaniasis. Those, they are going to have what? They are going to have what? Flagellates. They are like a whip-like structures. Okay, they use it for like movement like that. Okay, those are what we call flagellates. Good example are what? Trypanosomes. Okay, trypanosoma clues, will come and talk about them. Okay, that's a good example. So if you are talking about protozoa, unicellular organism, what you need to have in mind is that we'll talk about the amoeba, we'll talk about the ciliate, we'll talk about the sporozoa, also called what? Apicomplexa, also come and talk about what? A flagellate. So in the next video, we'll come and talk about what? The structure of the protozoa, the general structure, the general characteristics, then we go to amoeba classification, ending with what? Interamoeba histolytica. All the best, make sure that you study more. Okay.